So last week, I described how much of Christianity, kind of in the aftermath of the Reformation, there became a heavy emphasis on theology because so much of the Reformation was theological in nature, that it was a recognition of how Roman Catholicism had strayed from truth and how that had affected the practice of the church. And so with Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all the rest in their attempts to reform and purify the church, they instead found themselves outside of the church. And therefore forming what we know today as Protestantism. And so because of those theological differences, the importance of them, theology became the emphasis. And when theology and head knowledge kind of became the focus, what happened for the church was church life became stale, lifeless. Matters of the heart, matters of experience with the Lord and what Christian living looks like and feels like, those things kind of fell to the wayside. And so we looked at last week how that gave rise within Germany to what became called Pietism. And Pietism was this movement where it really strived to connect the head and the heart, if we can kind of put it in those terms. And so it was kind of begun. The father of Pietism was a man by the name of Frederick Jacob Spener, S-P-E-N-E-R. And he lived in the mid to late 1600s. And he started this movement in an attempt to again, bring back the idea of Christian experience, that it's not just about having your theology and doctrine right, but it's about walking with the Lord. It's about living life in ways that please Him and glorify Him in accordance with the truth. And so I think Spener was a very godly man. And did a great deal of good, and he had a great number of followers who followed him in this pietistic movement. But unfortunately, as we brought up last week, it also resulted in what became called radical pietism, and that was not long after pietism was actually formed. And what radical pietism says is if so the movement was, we go from all head, and then we move towards head plus heart. And then what radical pietism was took another step in that direction, said, well, then it's all heart. And essentially what radical pietism resulted in was what we might see with postmodern thinking today even, that there is no truth. You define your own reality, you define your own truth, and how you worship God, it doesn't matter. Doctrine doesn't matter. Theology doesn't matter. These things don't matter. Well, all that matters is your heart then. And that became very problematic within that movement. But I think the movement at its heart and at its core and at its start was very, very good for Christianity. I think we have a lot to learn from the Pietists in that sense. And so I brought up one last week, Count von Zinzendorf, who is a German noble. He lived in Saxony in northern Germany. And a part of this pietistic movement was held through this group from Moravia, who just simply be called the Moravians. And they were kind of these roving band that nobody wanted. And so Count von Zinzendorf allowed them to come onto his property and say, you guys can just camp out here. I got lots of land. Just, set down roots here on my property. And before long, he adopted their beliefs and then became kind of the head of that community, the Moravian Christians. And what's important about them as far as pietism and Christianity is they became very, very mission-minded. They sent missionaries everywhere, from India to the New World of the Americas. And so they were sending missionaries everywhere. I think I shared last week how there was even one group of Moravians who actually sold themselves into slavery just to be able to bring the gospel overseas. They couldn't afford tickets on a ship, and so they just sold themselves as slaves in order to be able to bring the gospel to people. So that's how passionate they were. Fearless and godly men and women. These Moravians were, and Count von Zinzendorf was kind of their head, and he was the godson of Spener, and a committed pietist as well. And so I bring all those things up because it really sets the stage for the discussion today, and that's what was happening in England and then in the Americas. And so in England, that's where we see the word evangelical arise. You know, it's a commonplace word today, and sometimes we think of it in terms of even politics, but that's not. That has nothing to do with the origin of the word. It just became a word that was used to describe how close a church or a belief or even a person was to the gospel. How close were they to the gospel? Were they evangelical? Were they, because evangelical is the same word for the gospel and the sharing of the gospel, and so the evangel is the gospel. So if it was evangelical, it was good. It was in line with the gospel. That's really all it meant. Is it in line with the gospel? And so that's where evangelicalism kind of got its start, and that happened in England. But it happened through the work of a well-known man named John Wesley. So John Wesley, born in 1703. And his father was a pastor, a minister in the Church of England, Samuel Wesley, and his well-known mother, Susanna. So John Wesley was 15th of 19 children. So 19 kids, and he was number 15. And Susanna, there's a couple kind of well-known stories about Susanna. I'll share at least one of them. But Susanna would take time out every week for the individual instruction of things of God with each of her children. Every week she'd set time out to spend one-on-one time with her kids for the express purpose of teaching them about the Lord. And so just incredible. But how organized do you have to be, right, to be that? And so keep that in mind. The organizational skills of Susanna were put to good use later on as well in her son. But one well-known story is that every day she would throw a blanket over herself in the corner of the room, and all the kids knew if the blanket is over mom's head and her chair in the corner, don't bother her. That's her alone time with the Lord. I mean, she's a mom of 19. There's nowhere she could go that was actually alone. So she would throw that blanket over herself in order to take that special time with the Lord, that one-on-one time that she knew was important to her and important for her whole family for her to take. And so I think just Susanna Wesley just displayed a lot of godly traits there as a mom, as a wife, as she strove to pursue that relationship with God first and foremost for herself. Wesley went to Oxford at the age of 17 and was a good student. He was very capable. Wesley came from a good family, and so he had a lot of opportunities, he was very successful at Oxford. A few years later, his younger brother Charles came. And while Charles was there, he became very kind of concerned with the state of Christianity there in England, especially at Oxford. He said it's all a bunch of scholars and people who just want to talk about theology, but nobody actually wants to talk about what life in Christ is, what life in Christ looks like. And so he started a little club, Charles did, and it got a nickname called the Holy Club. And in fact, it received a number of nicknames, and this would have been in the 1720s. It received a number of nicknames, and one of them was Methodists. And that was kind of the name that stuck. And so early on, they became known as Methodists. And so this Holy Club was looking for someone a little bit older, more knowledgeable, who could teach them and lead them. And they found a willing and capable teacher in Charles' older brother, John. So John would lead that group, and really it was just like what we might think of as small groups today. They'd get together, they'd open the Word together, talk about it, they would pray together, share testimonies, sing songs together, and it really just strove to encourage and bless one another, to keep one another accountable, and to live their lives before the Lord. And so in every respect, it was something good and something the church should have been doing. You know, and yet they couldn't find it. They didn't find it in the church, there in the Church of England, and so they formed it themselves and felt convicted to do that. So this Holy Club kind of started. After it had been going on for a few years, this young man, this very zealous, passionate young man, also joined the group for a time, and his name was George Whitefield. And so he became acquainted with the Wesleys early on at Oxford, part of their Holy Club group, and a part of that Methodist movement, if you will. And so we'll talk more about George here in a little bit. But
Pastor,
yeah.
the term Methodist
Mm-hmm.
have to do with method?
Yes, that's exactly what it is, yeah. So it adopted kind of some of, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but it came from really John Wesley's organizational skills. He was just an organizational genius, and he could establish hierarchy, administrate, and was able to organize this whole movement in such a way that it was really, really successful. And but it was all methodical. It was all. He drew very much on the ideals of the Enlightenment and science and the scientific process and organization and you know, he would have been probably an engineer or something, just maybe a math and science kind of a person, but highly intelligent, highly capable, but just an organizational genius. And that was really what set them really on the path to success in ways that some other movements didn't have. And so he was very much passionate about the Lord, passionate about people experiencing Christ in a very real way, but also wanted things organized and ordered, and he thought that was right as well. And I think he was right. And so, but so John became that leader of that group. And then in January of 1728, John Wesley became ordained in the Church of England, and began ministering in different places, so he was a little guy. He wasn't even quite 5'5", and some. Just scoop them right up, right? But in that way, he was very, very different from George Whitefield. So John Wesley was kind of meek, quiet, small. Like I said, came from a good family, good background, so very proper. George Whitefield had a rougher background, big, kind of boisterous, and was known for his loud, booming voice. And that will come to play here in a minute. But a friend suggested that John and Charles would find a very fruitful ministry in the New World. And so they worked for a little while to get on a ship, and finally left in January 1736 for Georgia. And it was a terrible, terrible trip across the Atlantic, full of storms. There were a number of times where the crew and passengers thought, we're goners, we're done for. And John Wesley was terrified, absolutely terrified. But he saw that there was this group who'd come out every day, and they would stand on deck, they would pray together, they would sing hymns together, and they never showed a single ounce of fear. And these were a group of Moravians. And so this group of Moravians, John got to know them, and he said, weren't you guys afraid? And they said, no, we know God's in control. We know that we're in his hands, and we know that even if we do die, we know where our eternity lies. And John Wesley started to think, I don't know if I know where my eternity lies. And he realized that he himself had not had this experience yet, and so for him it had still been this head knowledge, this theological assertion of the truth without actually experiencing that truth for himself. But before I get to that experience, he spent a couple of years in Georgia. By all accounts, a huge failure. Just awful. He fell in love with the 18-year-old niece of the head magistrate there in the town in Savannah, and she ends up marrying this other guy, and so John Wesley, to kind of in retaliation, essentially, barred her from communion. And so this young woman's husband, her name was Sophie Hopke, but Sophie's new husband then sues John Wesley. And so he finds himself really hated by everybody, and on the outs with everybody. And he just says, "I'm done. I can't take this anymore." And he goes back to England. He's feeling depressed. He's feeling down. And so the only thing he can think of, though, is this group of Moravians and what he saw within that group. He said, I don't know exactly what they had, but I know I want that. So he sought out this group of Moravians that was meeting there in I think it was London, and while he was there, they were just reading and looking at the introduction to Luther's commentary, Martin Luther's commentary on Galatians. They were just kind of reading this commentary there in this Bible study group, and they were still only in the introduction. But I'm going to read for you John Wesley's own words on it. He said, "In the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society meeting at Aldersgate Street where one was reading Luther's preface to the, Epistle to the Romans. Galatians was his brother Charles. Luther's preface to the Epistle of the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for my salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." And so that was his conversion moment. That happened May 24, 1738, reading the preface to Martin Luther's commentary on Romans. And a week before then, his brother Charles had gotten saved in a Bible study group reading the commentary of Martin Luther's commentary to the Galatians. So, but that phrase, "my heart was strangely warmed," it's kind of infamous for John Wesley, I mean. And so this warming of the heart, this experiential moment with Christ, it really drove everything he did and everything he was after that. And so later that summer, he actually went to go visit the Moravians in 1738 and in North Germany. And so what he found there was actually kind of, unfortunately, what he described as self-righteousness, and certainly what he would describe as a cult of personality around von Zinzendorf. And they just kind of revered him, and anything he said went, and so it just kind of became like, well, here on Zinzendorf's property, Zinzendorf was like a king, and he could do no wrong. But everything that they all did as the little followers of Zinzendorf became like, everybody else was horrible, wicked, and had something wrong with them. But these guys here in this place, they had everything right. And he just it was just, we might call it toxic. We might just say it wasn't a healthy place. It wasn't a healthy church by any means. And so he was, instead of joining the Moravians as being inspired by them all along, he went to actually see them at their sorts and was really turned off by it. And so he left and kind of feeling dejected, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. His old friend George Whitefield said, "You know what? You should try something." And so I'll get to that. But so before I mention what he said to try, let me talk about George Whitefield for a minute. Born in 1714, like I said, a rougher background, not a nobleman by any means. but on fire for Christ. And so in 1738, he spent 3 months in Georgia. And in that time, saw Georgia just come alive for Christ. And so this is what kind of became some of the beginning of what we'd call the Great Awakening in America, 1738. And so it happened a little bit earlier than that up in New England, but down in the South, through the ministry of George Whitefield, really the gospel really just started to blossom and bloom. And really, George Whitefield was not a deeply thoughtful theologian or anything like that. He just simply pleaded with people to turn from their flesh, turn from their sin, and simply preach the gospel of Christ. And so I've got 2 books of his sermons, and so he preached for quite a while. But I think he preached a lot of the same sermons. He was kind of like a roving revivalist, evangelist, and so he just kind of preached many of these similar sermons again and again. And so after his 3 months there, Whitefield's 3 months in Georgia, he returned to England to be ordained, but found that because of his particular style and also his background, that most churches didn't want to have anything to do with him. He couldn't find a pulpit anywhere in England. And so no one was willing to open up their church or their pulpits to him. And so finally, in February of 1739, he went out into a field in Bristol. And Bristol's coal mining country. These are common people, simple people, and yet these were neglected people by the church. Again, the state of the church and Christianity at this time was kind of very professional. You know, you got professional Christianity for professional people, and so it's almost like we might say it's for the white-collar folk, but for the regular blue-collar folk, you know, they're not worth our time. And so George Whitefield said that's not true. And so he went to coal mining country and stood in a field and preached the gospel. And he, what he described was that tears like white gutters ran down their black cheeks. And he said they turned to Christ in great numbers. And so he just found a great deal of success in what is called open air preaching. And that's what he did again and again and again. He just go to find a field, find just outside of a town, let it known that hey, there's going to be a preacher out there, and people would come and people would turn to Christ. And so he went to his old friend John Wesley and encouraged him. You know what? Maybe this is something you should think of too. And so he wasn't sure about it, but he went out to that same field, actually in Bristol. And despite some of his differences from Whitefield, he reluctantly went out to Bristol and he spoke to 3,000 people. And Wesley never turned back again. Never sought really a pulpit, never sought a church per se, but saw himself again as kind of a roving evangelist and spent most of the rest of his life on horseback. And so by the late 1730s, then the term Methodist became a synonym for evangelical. So evangelical, Methodist, those were kind of synonyms for one another. Here we go. And so, but in 1741, Wesley and Whitefield had a parting of ways. And it was over Calvinism. George Whitefield was very Calvinistic, and John Wesley was a staunch Arminian, and so they no longer served together, worked together, and yet even with all that, John Wesley spoke at Whitefield's funeral and called him a great man of God, great servant of God. But they just had very differences of belief, enough to drive them apart. But Whitefield's brand of Methodism, so Whitefield would still be called a Methodist, became what was called at the time Calvinistic Methodists. And Wesley didn't really say Arminian Wesley or Arminian Methodist. He kind of just stuck with the name Methodist, but his branch was much more successful, but very Arminian. And so this would be long time later. The followers of Wesley thought that Methodists had kind of strayed from Wesley's teachings. And so they started their own denomination called themselves Wesleyans. So Wesleyans were these followers who tried to stay true to John Wesley's teaching. And that's why they are much more clear Arminians than Methodists are today. Many Methodists believe you can't lose your salvation. But Wesleyans believe you can. And that is just straight Arminianism. Armenians believe you can lose your salvation, and so, but a lot of Methodists don't hold to that. We can talk maybe more about that later if we had time. But those Calvinistic Methodists later became the Presbyterian Church of Wales, and so Whitfield's branch of Methodism really took root in Wales and grew there. But both men remained passionate about bringing the gospel to people, in particular to outdoor preaching. Wesley, again, who took voluminous notes, at the end of his life, went over 250,000 miles on horseback, which is about 4,500 miles per year, just on horseback, and traveling from town to town. Yeah, I don't know how many horses he went through. Yeah, but unfortunately, both for Wesley and Whitfield, because of what they were committed to, both had failed marriages. Whitfield had a single child that died in childbirth, and Whitfield's like, God will protect him. I'm not even worried about it. And the child died. And so, for all their good qualities, they struggled in some important and significant areas. Yeah.
Okay, I'm confused. Whitfield was a staunch Arminian.
No, Whitfield was a Calvinist.
Calvin. Okay.
Wesley was the Arminian. Yep.
And so Whitfield formed the Methodist Church, which became Wesleyan?
No, that was Wesley. Yeah, Whitfield was the Calvinistic Methodist, which became the Presbyterian Church of Wales. Yep, so that was under Whitfield. Yeah, the W's.
You said Whitfield, was he part of the Holy Club?
Yeah, yep, for a little while back in Oxford. Yeah, yep.
This might be, but when you said went to Georgia, was it like a coastal place?
Yeah, it was the city of Savannah, there in Georgia. So it was a city, but still a colony at the time.
Yeah, that's one.
Yep.
Okay, yeah.
So Wesley went to Oxford in 17.
Yeah, 17 years old.
But then he was ordained in 28.
Mm-hmm.
Was he in the Holy Club that 8 years?
Yeah, I mean, he was really a part of it for that whole time period. Yeah, and so he continued his studies. And I'm not exactly sure all what he did with his time in that time period, but he did. Yeah, he continued with the Holy Club. The whole time.
And that was at Oxford.
That was at Oxford. Yes. Yep. Yeah.
Okay, I'm still confused here.
Sure.
So Whitfield was a Calvinist.
Yes.
And he went sort of Methodist to Presbyterian.
Yeah.
Are Presbyterians Calvinistic?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Officially, yes. There are denominations who call themselves Presbyterians who might officially claim that, but they're practicing Arminians.
Okay.
And that's because of their theological liberalism.
Yeah. So Wesley was Arminian, and he
Yeah.
formed the Methodist Wesleyan,
Yeah.
and they're Arminian. So
Yeah.
Methodists today are Arminian.
Yeah, so Methodists are Arminian, and not Arminian enough for the Wesleyans. And so that's why they broke off.
I check out.
Yeah, so that's why they broke off from Methodists and formed their own Wesleyan denomination. Yeah.
So Wesleyans are more Arminian than Methodists even?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions? So Whitefield actually went to the colonies 3 more times, and saw a great deal of success there, and stayed for longer and longer periods. And so, but bringing that his passionate preaching again to the States. But again, I mentioned another difference between Whitefield and Wesley was Wesley's organizational administrative skills. So he continued these holy club groups even within his Methodism, and so sometimes they were called class meetings. They had a class together, they met together, and again, it was just like our small groups. And so Wesley added this order and structure, again, all under the umbrella of Church of England. He is not actually his own denomination yet. This is still Church of England. And Methodist, well, I'll get to it, but but for now, I want to take a break from these two and turn to America's great theologian, and that's Jonathan Edwards. So Jonathan Edwards, brilliant. Out of the 3, Edwards was probably vastly more intelligent than the other 2. And so went to Yale at 13. Got his bachelor's there. It wasn't called Yale yet. I think it was just the College of New Jersey at the time, but it was Yale. But got his bachelor's degree and then went on to get his master's degree in theology. And so Edwards, he's been called the scholar's scholar, or the intellects of intellects, that kind of a thing. And so, like I said, just brilliant. In 1722, at the age of 19, he wrote what became called his resolutions. And so these are just things he decided to resolve his life to. Again, at the age of 19. I got this copy when I went off to Bible college. All the students got it. And I still think it should be a required reading for teenagers today. So his resolutions. Yeah, it's not super long. It's like almost a big pamphlet. I mean, it's so let me just read the first couple of them for you. It starts off each one with the word resolved. Okay, so he says, resolved that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to God's glory and to my own good, profit and pleasure in the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never so many myriads of ages hence. Resolved to be continually endeavoring to find out some new invention and contrivance to promote the forementioned things. 3, resolved, if ever I shall fall and grow dull, so as to neglect to keep any part of these resolutions, to repent of all I can remember when I come to myself. 4, resolved, never to do any manner of thing, whether in soul or body, less or more, but what tends to the glory of God, nor suffer it, if I can possibly avoid it. 5, resolved, never to lose any moment of time, but improve it the most profitable way I possibly can. 6, resolve to live with all my might while I do live. I mean, just incredible, right? At 19 to go, I don't want to waste a single second. I want to live with all my might and improve upon my time here on this earth in whatever way I have and however much time I have left. Just incredible. Just incredible. So I can pass this around. You guys can look at it if you want, but again, I think that should be required reading for every Christian, but especially for teens. And it's just him saying, this is what I'm resolved to live for, and to have goals, right? I think that's something we see lacking in a lot of maybe young people, and not necessarily just young people. It's just thinking we're just going to drift along through life and everything's going to be okie dokie. That's not life. That shouldn't be life. We should have these goals, these Christian resolutions, things that we're resolved to live for. And so he committed to that at a very young age. He rose every morning at 4 o'clock and spent 13 hours in study. Whoa. But he was still a family man. He had 11 children and was a good, capable father. And so different from Wesley and Whitefield in that respect as well. So Edwards' father was an influential pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts. So Edwards is a New England man. And so Edwards became his assistant pastor in 1729. And later that year, his father actually died. And so Edwards became the sole minister of a congregation that consisted of 200 families. So a pretty good-sized church. Edwards was really grieved, though, by the state of Christianity in New England at the time, by the duplicity and the diluted faith. So he just started praying. He said, God, bring a harvest. That was his prayer. Very simple, very short and sweet. God, bring a harvest. Bring a harvest here. Your gospel can work. Your gospel can do things. Your gospel is powerful. God, bring a harvest. And in 1734, revival hits New England, particularly his area of Northampton in Massachusetts. It swept through the church and really much of New England at this time. And so thousands were saved in the 1730s and 1740s. And with Edwards in the north and Whitefield in the south, it really connected all the colonies within this, what became called the Great Awakening. And this great revival. And you know how it came about? Just people preaching, praying, reading the Bible together, and talking. What we might call the ordinary means of grace. There was, Whitefield strived to evangelize and witness, but there weren't like huge tents erected and come out to this revival meeting where we're going to hold a revival. Like, nobody was saying that. They just wanted people to come to Christ. And yet revival is exactly what happened, which is what I think one of the distinguishing features between a real revival, a genuine revival, and one that's coerced, maybe, or forced, is revival is just the Holy Spirit working through the ordinary means of grace, of Christianity. And I don't want us to forget the work of the Puritans that set all these kind of puzzle pieces in place for this revival to happen. So the Puritans were very much for these things that Edwards and Whitefield and Wesley were promoting and preaching about, but they were very much in the minority. The Puritans were kind of these exiles, these ones who kicked out of their own country and kicked out of their churches and kicked out of their pulpits. And so they went to the new colonies, the new world, really to look for that religious freedom. And so the Puritans were really the ones who set the stage for this. It's a good reminder that no matter what age we live in, right, God can bring revival. God can move in powerful and important ways, but even if he doesn't in our time, perhaps he's using us to prepare for that. And so it's a great encouragement, I think, for us to see how the Puritans and all their work and all their study and all their sermons worked to pave the way for thousands and thousands of people in the new world to come to Christ. Okay, so just incredible. And so during this time, it was late of 1739, early 1740, Whitefield comes back to America, and he kind of traveled up and down the eastern seaboard for a couple of years at that time, and was a part of that Great Awakening. In July 1741, Edwards preaches a very, very famous sermon. Anyone know the name of it? You might recognize it when I say it. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So his most well-known sermon. And so Edwards, again, was a scholar, highly intelligent man. He wasn't like Whitefield in this booming, passionate plea. He would write out his sermons and then read them. That was Edwards' style. When he gave this sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, there were a number of times where he had to just stop reading because his voice was being drowned out by all the crying and weeping of the congregation. And they're just so overwhelmed by this simple, direct recitation of the wrath of God and the grace that is found in Jesus Christ alone. So a famous illustration that Edwards uses is that for the sinner, that God so hates sin that God so despises evil that for him to look on us at all, it's like, he said, it's like a person holding a spider by the leg. He's like, everything in you just wants to drop it, like just fling it from you. He said, that's what God is like with us. He doesn't come to us and go, oh, you're so lovely, you're so important, I can't imagine heaven without you. Edward's like, that's not what God's like at all. God, you're enemies with God. And so you're like a spider held over the flames. And the only hope you have is for God's grace. That's it. The only hope you have is for God to not righteously, justly throw you in the flames. And so a very powerful image, and a very famous one from a very famous sermon. But a lot of people don't preach the wrath of God anymore. And I don't think that's right either. I think we rightly talk about his love and grace and mercy, but we also have to talk about his justice and holiness and his wrath against sin. Otherwise, people will go, saved? Saved from what? Why would I need to be saved? I'm doing great. My life's doing just fine, right? So people need to realize the problem before they can be convinced by the solution. So in 1746, he wrote a very famous book, I think still one worth reading, though Edwards is kind of tough to read. It's called Religious Affections. So again, these men were marked by this combination of head and heart. And so Edwards very capably described how the Christian should be marked by these passions, these affections, these emotions was too weak a word, and so that's why he uses this term affections, that really everything within a person should be moved towards the glory of God and to serving him and loving him and worshiping him, and so he wrote a number of incredible works, but that might be one of his more well-known and famous. 1750, Edwards was convicted that communion should really be reserved only for confessing believers who display evidence of salvation, regeneration. And his church disagreed. Remember, at this time, still a lot of churches were caught up in the idea that if you're a citizen of our community, a citizen of our city, citizen of our state, you're a member of a church. It doesn't matter about your conversion or salvation, you're a member of the church. And so everyone got communion. And so, again, the vast majority of Christianity at this time was still baptizing infants, saying this brings you in the kingdom. And so, but Edwards was working against that. And so even for all that he had done and all that he had helped really Christianity to see at this time, the church kicked him out because he wanted to reserve communion just for genuine Christians. And so they kicked him out. But in 1758, he became the president of Princeton. What's that?
Went to Yale, but then became.
Yep. Yeah. So all these Ivy League, schools, and they all, again, I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, they all started out as, seminaries and Bible colleges, and some fell more quickly away from Orthodox Christianity than others, but I would say they probably all are now, But became the president of Princeton, and yet he wasn't there for very long. So Edwards was again highly intelligent, capable man, and believed in what we would call common grace. That God has given good things to us through much of the things we can know and experience just from the world, and one of those things was medicine. And so while some people were very fearful of this new thing called vaccines, he said, no, this is something we should embrace, and this is something we should accept as a gift from God. These vaccinations are something very good. And so he went and got a smallpox vaccination, which ended up killing him.
Oh, gosh.
And so it was a bad vaccine. And so, but yeah, he ended up dying later in 1758. So he was only president of Princeton for a matter of months before he passed away at
Aaron.
age of 55. Yeah,
So when you say he got kicked out of the church, what church are you speaking
his
of?
church in Northampton,
Okay, not the church. in
Massachusetts.
England. He has just-
Correct. Edwards is American through and through. Never part of Church of England or anything to do with
And
England.
so the church of Northampton, you say?
Yeah.
What kind of church was
I
that?
don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. And so,
Methodist?
no, they didn't have that kind of a thing as a thing yet. And so, yeah, I don't think it had any ties to Church of England. I have to look into that. So that is a good question. I'm not sure. Other questions?
No vaccines didn't go over very well after that.
Yeah, that might have, caused a little bit of a hiccup there. And
So at this time, the Moravians have their own, like, don't they live as colonies?
kinda, yeah.
So you've got the what about the Puritans at this time?
Puritans were kind of no more. So some argue that Edwards was the last Puritan, and some think that that's still too late for Puritanism, and so they don't include him. Most don't include Edwards as a Puritan, but some do, but only as the last Puritan. But many people who were affected by them greatly. Martin Lloyd-Jones in England in the 1900s was very much influenced by the Puritans, talked about them all the time, and relied on them a great deal. So people today, I think, benefit greatly from the Puritans. So there's a seminary in Grand Rapids called Puritan Theological Seminary. And so it's the president of that school is a man named Joel Beeke. And I think it's just Beeke. He talks about the Puritans all the time. He's very much at work in reproducing these Puritan works, getting them in the hands of people, and so Joel Beeke is very much wants for people to understand that, and it's a really good seminary. I kind of wish I'd gone there, but it's not what God had for me. So, but it is a good school, and it still relies a great deal on the Puritans themselves.
What are some earmarks of the Puritan that you liked about the Puritan theology?
Sure. So really just saw a purity of the gospel. They desired to preach the word and the whole counsel of the word. And they desired really to dig as deep into Scripture as they possibly could go. And so for them, they were all about the Word. Really, the tenets of the five solas of the Reformation was really the torch that they continued to carry as these Puritans. But what got them in a lot of hot water was really their stance on Scripture. In the Book of Common Prayer that was being kind of pushed upon them, they didn't want to be restricted by this book that the Church of England was forcing on them, and so they had to leave their churches or were kicked out of their churches, and some went to Europe and some went to the New World, one Puritan I didn't bring up was John Bunyan. Another required reading, I think, for every Christian is Pilgrim's Progress, and so it's a work of fiction, and yet I think still greatly beneficial as it addresses a lot of Christian life and Christianity and Christian theology, but in this kind of narrative way that is reminiscent, I think, of like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In some cases, and there's updated language of it. So John Bunyan was just a commoner as well, and John Owen was a Puritan at the same time. But John Owen was very scholarly, intellectual, similar to Edwards in that respect. But John Owen would go out to hear John Bunyan preach, and so one of his fellow scholars said to John Owen, like, "Why do you go out there to hear that tinkerer and metal worker, preach to these people?" And John Owen says, I would give all my book learning if I could preach like that man. You know, and so John Bunyan was just a really influential Puritan. Another Puritan, Matthew Henry. Anybody familiar with that name? So a lot of people's shelves filled with Matthew Henry's commentary on the whole Bible, and still really excellent commentary. And so a lot of Puritan writings and stuff you can get for free now digitally if you're into that. But Matthew Henry's commentary is still excellent. Actually, they had to finish it from his notes because he died before he could publish it all. But I think it's 5 or 6 volumes. Yeah, commentary on the whole Bible. But anyway, yeah. Any other questions, thoughts? Real quick. Methodism grew in America. 1773, American Methodist Conference began in Philadelphia, but needed some leaders. And so John Wesley pleaded with the Church of England, send some leaders here. And Church of England either just ignored it or refused. And so Wesley said, well, they need some leaders. So he sent some leaders to this Methodist group in Philadelphia. And Church of England was not happy with it. They're like, Wesley, who do you think you are? Right? We're the church leaders, not you. But because of that, not long after, 1784, the Methodist Church of America broke away from the Church of England and became a new distinct denomination. March 2nd, 1791, John Wesley, at the age of 88, passes away. 79,000 people, members of his Holy Club, Methodists, left in England. 79,000, 40,000 in America. And not long after his death, Methodists broke away from the Church of England. Perhaps they were only staying because Wesley refused to leave the Church of England. He's like, I'm Church of England, I'm Anglican till I die. And he was. Though there was a lot of tension between Wesley and the Church of England. And finally, Methodists eventually did break away from the Church of England. I didn't bring up Charles Wesley. There's not a ton to say about him other than a magnificent hymn writer. Oh, for 1,000 tongues, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, And Can It Be, Christ the Lord is risen today, Come thou long expected Jesus. So anywhere between 6,500 and 7,000 hymns he wrote and were hugely influential in encouraging the gospel and Methodism as well. And so a lot of songs still sung today written by Charles Wesley.
6,500?
Yeah.
Well, they said 1,000.
No, 6,500, yeah.
Cool.
Yep. Yeah, quite a few songs. I've never written one, so.
Well, you better get
I know, right? So anyway, that's it. That's what we have for. Yeah, go ahead.
So would you say that, could it be said that the Methodist Church of America, you called it, or Methodist, what'd you call it?
Yeah, they became United Methodists down the road.
Would you say this was the first denominational church in America?
There were other groups, and so.
Because there's like Quakers, whatever.
Yeah, there were Quakers, there were Baptists, there were Presbyterians, yeah, and so really, like I said, the three main groups after the Reformation were Lutherans, Anabaptists, and Reformers or Presbyterians, depending on where you lived. So those denominations probably were all certainly present within the U.S. at the time.
Connected to the Church of
No, I don't think so. And so I don't know. So Anglicanism did eventually kind of put down some roots in the U.S., but they're called Episcopalians. And so the Episcopalians are the ones who adhere to the Book of Common Prayer and Anglicanism. And for a while they were very successful, but I think again their embrace of theological liberalism and progressive ideals is really essentially killed that denomination in the U.S.
amazing thing is like now some of these denominations are coming back together.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think it's the United Church of Canada, maybe, what it's called. It's like Episcopalian, Methodist,
Sure, yeah.
Unitarian,
Yep.
they're like creating new denominations because they're dying.
So yeah, theological liberalism too just says, well, when theology doesn't really matter that much, let's just get together, and especially since we seem to be petering out. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll pray and then.